everybody. I'm Russell Stagg. I'm a therapist in London, Canada. My expertise is in trauma. My passion is in working with survivors of sexual trauma. But it wasn't rape. That's a phrase I hear all too often in my practice. I couldn't say no, but it wasn't rape. I was afraid to say no, but it wasn't rape. So here's the thing. If you couldn't say no, if you were afraid to say no, if you were too drunk or high to say no, if you were too young to say no, if you were coerced in any way, it was rape. And I'm telling you that because it's important not to minimize or deny what happened. The title of my talk includes the term sexual trauma. It's not sexual abuse, it's not sexual assault, it's not sexual violence, it's not rape. Those are all things that happened in the past. The word trauma literally means a wound. Sexual trauma is what's happening right now. You don't just get over it. A typical scenario in my practice is a woman comes in. She starts to tell her story, and she starts sobbing. She sobs for 10 minutes, and at the end she says, "I'm sorry. I just can't tell you about the rape." And I say, that's okay. You just did. Sexual trauma causes a lot of damage. It affects just about every area of your life. And here are some of them. You experience constant irritation, what one client referred to as a constant hum. You fly into a rage for no reason and you don't know why you're doing that. You have flashbacks. You encounter some reminder of the trauma, a smell, a sound, a visual reminder, and all of a sudden you're back there. Or you have a sudden overwhelming emotion that seems to come out of nowhere, but it's actually a flashback to emotion you experienced as part of the trauma. You have nightmares. That's a big one. Night terrors. You wake up in the night terrified for no reason, and it takes you a while to calm down. Panic attacks. Panic over absolutely nothing that seems to come out of the blue. You have difficulty concentrating on anything. Your mind just won't go there. You're constantly on guard. You have an exaggerated startle reaction. Trouble sleeping. Zoning out. You're just not there. This can be dangerous if you're driving. These are all symptoms of PTSD, which is 6 times more likely in survivors of sexual trauma. And here's the big one. Numbing out with drugs and alcohol. If you're a survivor of sexual trauma, you're 26 times more likely to abuse drugs. You're 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol. Survivors of sexual trauma are much more likely to experience eating disorders or to engage in self-harm like cutting or burning. It's easier to focus on your body than the hurt inside. Trauma survivors have 4 times the incidence of suicidal depression. You're much more likely to experience domestic violence because you're carrying around the message that you're there to be used and taken advantage of. Even if you don't experience domestic violence, there's a good chance you're experiencing relationship problems. I counsel couples and I can instantly recognize when one or both couples has a history of sexual trauma. It affects how you relate to others. You're much more likely to experience workplace abuse because you might as well be carrying around a placard that says victim. For some of you, I'm sure the workplace is the source of the sexual trauma. You need help. There are wonderful therapists out there, but there are some that should carry a warning label. Here are some of my thoughts on finding a good one. If you've experienced sexual trauma, your greatest need is to find a therapist you feel safe with. I'm often amazed at clients who come into my office and they say they've seen a dozen therapists and weren't able to disclose the sexual trauma to any of them. I'm an old Jewish guy, and many of my clients are women, and they say they're talking to me because they feel safe with me. It's not about gender, it's about feeling safe. Do you feel heard? Do you feel that the therapist really understands what you're going through? When you start to get emotional, is the therapist there for you? Is the therapist saying things like, "Tell me more. What's going on?" Is the therapist perhaps not saying anything, but just leaning forward and looking at you and inviting you to express what you feel? Those are the signs of a good therapist. What we're talking about here is empathy. Empathy is not to be confused with sympathy. Sympathy is, gee, I'm sorry to hear about that. Empathy is the ability to put themselves in your situation, to feel your feelings and think your thoughts and understand them. When you deal with peer counselors and therapists and Pineapple Support, you're dealing with people who get it, who understand where you're coming from. We may have been there ourselves. You should feel listened to. You start to heal the moment you feel heard. You should feel understood. You should feel safe. These are the absolute minimum requirements for a good therapist, no matter what techniques he or she uses. Honesty is important. A therapist is not there to sell you anything. The therapist should not offer you guarantees or make assurances. A good therapist shouldn't pretend to know it all. Seeming hesitant and unsure is actually a very good thing. A good therapist will ask, did I get that right? Did I understand correctly? They recognize they're not the experts on you. The expert on you is you. You should feel supported. You should feel respected. You should feel the therapist is on your side. If at any point you feel the therapist is looking down on you, that's probably more about you than them, but you need to talk about it. So let's assume you found your therapist. Here's a summary of how therapy for trauma typically works. A typical client might come in having experienced a minor fender bender months ago. He's still having nightmares about it. He's having panic attacks. He's not sleeping. It doesn't seem to make sense. So I ask him, what was going on in your head when you had this fender bender? And he'll say, well, I felt victimized. I felt powerless. I knew what was going to happen and I couldn't stop it. I felt trapped. Those messages don't seem to make much sense for a minor fender bender. So I ask him, I have the sense those feelings go way back. And that's the point at which he tells me. He was gang raped as a teen. I asked him what he felt. He said, I felt victimized. I felt powerless. I knew what was going to happen, and I couldn't stop it. That's the point at which it ceased to be a matter of motor vehicle trauma and became a case of sexual trauma. The most effective approaches to healing trauma involve the techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Pineapple Support has a course on DBT which uses the methods of CBT. It's worth explaining how CBT works in dealing with trauma. You might think that your emotions are a response to what happens to you, and they're not. Seriously, they're not. Let me explain. Let's make up a chart. On the left we put what happened, on the right we put the consequence. What happened is the activating event, we call it. A minor fender bender. The consequence, panic, nightmares, not sleeping. Does that make sense? Well, of course not. We know there's something missing. What's missing is what comes between the activating event and the consequence, a belief. I'm being victimized again. It's just like when I was gang raped, I'm powerless. You put these all together, it's called an ABC chart. Some therapists will actually have you make one up. The aim is to change your beliefs so you have different consequences. Obviously, it's a lot easier said than done. A therapist can help you reflect on the ways you take charge in your life. They can help you see all the ways you're not a victim, you're not powerless. And the more you can see yourself as powerful and assertive, the less likely you are to be triggered. If you're dealing with deep-seated trauma, you're going to need a therapist, but there's no harm in doing this exercise. In fact, it's probably helpful. You could get a piece of paper, and for every upsetting event, you make 3 columns, and then see what happens if you can change column 2. So let's look in this case, what would happen? There's a minor fender bender, and you're saying to yourself, I'm taking control of my life. It was never about me. My past no longer defines me. What's the consequence? What a pain. Oh well. You see how it works? Your beliefs determine your consequences. Many of my clients come to me months, years, even decades after the trauma. They're in a relatively comfortable place and they're finally ready to deal with it. Many of you aren't so lucky. Some of you are even in the middle of an abusive situation. You're dealing with a director who won't take no for an answer. You're dealing with an abusive boyfriend who's threatening to throw you out in the street. You say, I'm trapped. There's no way out. How can I possibly help you? I get that you're feeling trapped and you feel you have no choice. I get that. I get that you can't believe talking to someone could possibly help. But here's the thing. Whether you realize it or not, you're talking to someone all the time. Someone who's really negative, really down, hopeless, puts a negative spin on everything. You're talking to yourself. And when you're depressed or anxious, when you're feeling traumatized, you're talking to someone who's only going to make things worse. When I was little, I lived on a dairy farm in Devon. I'd watch the cows go to the pasture and chew on the grass. They'd swallow it, they'd digest it a bit, they'd bring it up again, they'd chew it some more, they'd swallow it, they'd digest it some more. And this process of bringing up food again and again is called rumination. Psychologists use the term to describe what people do when they're depressed or anxious or traumatized. Your mind keeps bringing the same thoughts up again and again. Rumination is really bad. You get depressed. You think depressing thoughts, which makes you more depressed, so you have even more depressing thoughts. You spiral into depression. You actually think yourself into depression. But when you reflect, you see things differently. Your problem looks smaller. You see possibilities instead of obstacles. You're looking at your problem with a telescope instead of a microscope. Psychologists have found that one of the best indicators of your ability to overcome trauma is your ability to reflect rather than ruminate. You probably can't do that on your own. Peer counselors and therapists are trained in reflective listening. So let me explain how it works. You're desperately trying not to think about your situation. But the more you try, the more you end up thinking about it. And my advice to you is, stop trying. Just accept that things are not okay. When you can reflect on what you're going through, when you can accept that it's okay not to be okay, that's the point at which I can help you. When you reflect on what you're going through, when you feel heard and understood, that's when you start to heal. Counselors don't have answers. The answers are already inside you. We help you find them. I can't change the fact that your life situation sucks. I can't change your abusive director or boyfriend. I can't create a miracle. But here's the thing. You think you'll feel better about yourself when you find solutions to problems in your life. You're wrong. You'll find solutions to problems in your life when you feel better about yourself. A therapist or peer counselor trained in reflective listening can help you reflect on your life so you see things differently and feel differently, so you can start making the changes you need to make in your life. When I put this talk together, I realized there were important questions I absolutely needed to address because I get asked them so often. So let's take a few minutes to discuss them here. Do I have to revisit the trauma? The answer is no. Here's the thing. You're paying a therapist for 50 minutes of his or her time. You are in charge. And if you don't want to revisit the trauma, you shouldn't have to. And if a therapist refuses to accept your no, that's an ethics violation. You should never feel pressured into something that's not right. You may have so many problems you don't know where to start. Well, you start anywhere. If there's an addiction or an eating disorder that's getting to the point where your life is in danger, obviously that's where we need to go. But addictions, PTSD, and depression, it's a package deal called trauma. We're working on changing it. Often the best place to start is where it's easiest to make change. It might help to find a therapist who understands trauma, not just addictions, for example. You don't want someone to tell you to change your lifestyle. We pineapple therapists get it. We really do. We're not going to tell you what to do with your life. We're not going to tell you what not to do with your life. We're here to help you find answers that fit for you. I've done some illegal stuff and I don't want to get reported. Therapists are bound by a code of confidentiality. Obviously, we're required to report child abuse or imminent harm to yourself or someone else. But if you've been dealing on the side that's confidential, trust me, I was a therapist in Nanaimo, BC, a major drug center, and a lot of my clients dealt on the side. One of them even wanted to pay me in his product. I want to explore options within the industry. Can you help me? Yes. For example, I've had a couple of clients exploring becoming dominatrixes. If you were in this situation, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But clients often tell me they like to bounce things off me. What might be the pluses? Probably a sense of power and control. What might be the minuses? Serious concerns for your safety. Being exploited, being stalked, and then making sure you do things in a safe, sane, and consensual manner. I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to help you come to the conclusion you need to. As we close, I want to tell you a story. On the evening of March 6th, 1987, the car ferry Herald of Free Enterprise left the Belgian port of Zeebrugge en route to Dover. As it chugged past the breakwater, it suddenly capsized and sank in 90 seconds. Of 539 people on board, 187 died. You might think no good could come of that disaster. You would be wrong. Professor Stephen Joseph has related how 3 years later he interviewed survivors of this disaster. He found 46% were experiencing negative consequences: PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal depression. But here's the surprise: 42%, almost as many, reported positive consequences. This was an astonishing discovery, and a year later, when the cruise ship Jupiter sank off Greece, he was able to confirm these findings. They've been confirmed over and over again, and psychologists now refer to this phenomenon as post-traumatic growth. What are the consequences of post-traumatic growth? Greater appreciation for relationships. 91% of the Jupiter survivors said yes to that. 88% said they valued people more. 71% said they had become more understanding and tolerant. In other surveys, people reported they had a greater sense of what's important. People said they were tougher. They said they were more compassionate, more loving, more spiritual. Sexual trauma can destroy your life like a hammer destroying a beautiful vase. You can't put that vase back together again, but out of its pieces, you can create something new, something surprising, something good. My wish for you is that you'll find hope. Hope that things can get better. Hope that you will find people there for you. Hope that you will find resources there for you. If you've experienced sexual trauma, please reach out for that help.